Welcome to Buried Secrets, a podcast about the paranormal, the occult, and weird and forgotten history. I'm Chris. You could say that ghosts are traces of what people leave behind when they die or leave an area. And in this episode, I want to talk about some other traces that people leave behind. This episode is definitely going to be more in the forgotten history side of things versus the paranormal side of things, but this is the first of several episodes that I want to do about a couple state parks in North Carolina that I've done a decent amount of hiking in, and that I've also done some paranormal investigations in, and one of them in particular has a number of haunting type stories associated with it. But to kick us off, I just want to talk about the history of one of these two state parks, because it's really fascinating and I think it sets up really well some of the more paranormal stuff that I want to talk about. So I've talked about North Carolina a few times on the podcast, and while I have never lived in North Carolina for more than a few months at a time, my wife and I did spend much of 2020 living with my sister and her husband in Raleigh, North Carolina. So because of this, I've spent a decent amount of time hiking around the area, because there's a beautiful array of state parks and greenways and just, beautiful woods to walk around in the area. In particular, in 2020, I went on a number of hikes in William B. Umstead State Park in Raleigh, and I also went on a few hikes in Eno River State Park in Durham, though I didn't go there as often because it was further away. Like I said, I want to go over the history of these two parks as well as talk about some of the paranormal investigation type stuff I've done there. And in particular, I want to talk about my trip to Raleigh over Halloween weekend 2021, because not only did I have some unusual experiences, mostly in Eno River State Park, especially in this one hidden cemetery in the park that is famous for having paranormal activity, but the trip itself just ended up being a bit weird. And a lot of honestly bad and weird stuff happened while we were there. And when I think back on that time, it feels like this pocket of bad vibes. And when I was preparing to do what I thought was just going to be one episode about these parks and that trip in particular, I was reading back over my notes and my brain had kind of blocked out some of the weird paranormal stuff that had happened during those hikes and just in general some of the weirdness of that weekend. So I do want to talk about all of that, but first I want to talk about the history of these parks. And I think what makes these parks so interesting to me is, they weren't always parks. I don't know that much about state parks in general, so this might be a thing for most state parks, but for these two at least, they were places where people lived, and then later they were converted into state parks. So both of these parks, you can hike around and you'll find ruins of people's homes and other traces of industry and people's gardens and that sort of thing. I think we think of wooded areas as being kind of untouched or set aside, for recreation. But the truth is that often there is a long history before that is still very visible and very interesting. So this episode I'll talk about Umstead State Park. Next episode I'll probably just focus on the history of Eno River State Park in Durham. And then in the third episode of this series, I'm going to talk about the solo Estes sessions that I did in those parks, the EVP sessions that I did there, an interesting interaction that I had with someone who I met in the park, as well as just some of the weird stuff that happened during my last trip to North Carolina. So let's talk about William B. Umstead State Park in Raleigh, North Carolina. It is a 5,599 acre park located in between the cities of Raleigh, Cary, and Durham. It's part of the East Coast Greenway, which is a trail system that goes between Maine and Florida. And I think that I've hiked all of the hiking trails in the park. There are about 20 miles of those, the longest of which is the 7.2 mile long Sycamore Trail. And there are also about 13 miles of multi-use trails in the park. So that's for biking, horseback riding, as well as hiking and running and all that stuff. So there's plenty of stuff to do in the park. If you find yourself in the Triangle, I highly recommend that you check it out. It's one of my favorite places to hike. And I'll say that the hikes in the park are not really difficult at all. It's just a little bit hilly, but aside from that, it's an easy place to hike. So that's the park today. Let's look at its history. So this park was established in 1937, and prior to that, people lived on the land, of course. I believe that the indigenous peoples who lived there were the Tuscarora, the Catawba, the Lumbee, and the Occaneechi, at least according to nativeland.ca, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced those. I am not always the best at pronunciation. There were some important trade trails that went through the area, including the Occaneechi Trail, which was north of what is currently the park, and the Petey Trail that was south of there. And then in 1774, colonizers started getting land grants for the area, so the forests were cleared, and at first, farming went pretty well there, but unfortunately, the cultivation practices that were used were really not good, and they were doing mostly one crop production, which screwed up the soil. That's according to Wikipedia. I also found a 1995 government report that was like an application for the park for the National Register of Historic Places, and I'll be referencing that report a lot throughout this, but that report said that corn and cotton were the two main crops that were grown there until the 1880s. And the report also said that the colonizers had, quote, denuded the area of trees because they cut so many down when constructing different buildings there. And the report said that because they got rid of so much of the forest, that allowed a lot of erosion. And then the erosion is what destroyed the soil and made the land unstable and unusable. So by the early 1900s, it was mostly just subsistence farming that was happening there because the land had been so damaged. And people continued to overcut the trees, and they would sell them, use them for fuel, building materials, and cooking. But the situation was not good because of these bad farming practices, etc. So in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, farmers tried to grow cotton by the creek, which is called Crabtree Creek, and it just wasn't happening. At that point, the land was considered submarginal, which means not suitable for farming. So everyone who was living there and trying to farm was really struggling. The government report said that both black farmers and white farmers were living there, and it sounds like everyone had pretty large families and small farms, and it was just a bad situation. So if you're from the United States, you probably know that in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, there were a bunch of different government programs to try to help people who were, like starving, suffering, etc. One of those programs was to help people by buying up their submarginal land so that way they could get some money for it. And then, they could turn that land into parks, and then they could employ people, to help build these parks. Because, you might think that you can just, leave land and let that become a park, but there was actually a lot of work that needed to be done, and this created a bunch of jobs when, in 1934, federal and state agencies bought that land, and the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration brought in people to build the park. And, if you live in the United States, probably no matter where you live, you'll notice there's a ton of public works that were built in the 1930s through these programs. There's so much of the infrastructure here that came from that, whether it was bridges or parks, etc. So that's the creation of the park. In 1950, 1,000 acres, so like a fifth of the park, a little less than a fifth of the park, was designated as a separate park for Black people called the Reedy Creek State Park. From what I read, it sounds like prior to that, the park was at least somewhat integrated. I read about some cabins that were designated for Black campers that were built in the 1930s and early 1940s. And while there was that one camp, which I think was called Camp Whispering Pines, where African American people were allowed to camp, it's kind of unclear to me who was allowed to hike on the trails prior to 1950. But at any rate, in 1950, the park was split into two areas, which were divided by Crabtree Creek. And, this was during segregation in America, which was one of many terrible times in American history. But, I wanted to read this little bit from a blog called South by Southeast, which talks a little bit about the discourse around the park at the time. So to read from this blog, writing about improvements to the parks in 1950, the Raleigh News and Observer provided a perverse note of reassurance to white parents that a large forested buffer would separate the white and African American youth camps, stating that the two camps would be more than a mile apart at the Crabtree Creek dividing line. Umstead was actually only one of 2 state parks in North Carolina that was designated for Black people to use, and then a third one was opened in 1961. So it wasn't until 1966 when the park for white people, the Crabtree Creek area, which had been renamed for the former Governor William B. Umstead, and then Reedy Creek Park, were combined, and that was a single park that became open for everybody. So now that whole park was just called William B. Umstead State Park. Nowadays, if you go to the park, it is still pretty obvious that it was once a segregated park because there are 2 entrances on either side of the park, and you can't drive from one entrance to the other. There are roads throughout the park, especially on the Crabtree Creek side, where you can drive to different parts of the park, and there's a lake you can drive to and different parking lots and stuff, but you can't actually drive from one side to the other. So, this is a place that kind of wears its history on its sleeves, but you could probably say that about most places if you kind of look beneath the surface just a little bit. And also, while you're in the park, you can still see remnants of the farmers who used to live on that land. So you might be walking along a trail and you look off to the side and see the foundation of a house or some sort of building or some chimneys. And it's not as dramatic as some of the ruins that I'll talk about next time in Eno River State Park, but they're definitely there. And I think that one of my favorite tidbits of this story and the experience of looking at the park's history nowadays as you walk through it is what I like to call ghost gardens. So I've read that if you are there at the right time of year, you can look out into the woods and you'll see patches of tulips or daffodils, and that would indicate where people's front yards are. Because even though their homes are gone, it's not like someone dug up the bulbs from these perennials. So they keep coming up year after year, even almost 100 years later. And I just love that idea. I think there's something so beautiful about how these remnants of nature have held on, even after the human habitations and buildings have disappeared and the human crops have disappeared. There's still these tulips and daffodils that are growing. And I haven't been there during the right time of year to see these, but if you are there in the spring, I would keep an eye out for them because apparently they are visible from the trail. And also, apparently there are oak trees that also show where people's front yards might have been. There's also one area off the Grayland Trail, which is one of the multi-use trails, where there used to be some homes. So to read from that 1995 government report that I mentioned, before the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, destroyed them, there were as many as 8 houses on either side of the road, with the exception of the King family cemetery. Wisteria vines and mimosa trees mark the locations of some of the homestead sites. So keep an eye out for wisteria and mimosa as well. And I think this is really interesting because I bet this is true for other state parks as well. So, if you don't live in North Carolina, but you frequent a park in your area, it's definitely worth looking up the history and seeing whether there are some plants that might have been grown in the gardens of people who lived in the area before it was a park. And that's like an interesting way to imagine what that land looked like at some point in the past. One fun thing that I learned about this park while doing this research is that there are also apparently 2 explosives magazines that had been built there for holding dynamite. I've seen them called dynamite sheds in the government reports, but they were built by the CCC in 1936, so they would have housed dynamite that they used while constructing the park. And the walls of these sheds are more than 2.5 feet thick, and the roofs were made out of cement, of course, and they're hidden in the woods. One of them is located off of the Sycamore Trail, and I'm not sure where the other one is. As I've walked around, I haven't noticed these, not that I can remember, but next time I go there and hike, I'll definitely keep an eye out because, how often do you get to see an old dynamite shed as you're going for a walk. One of the more well-known areas of ruins in the park is the old company mill. So there's a trail called Company Mill Trail. There's a millstone off of that trail, which a park historian found in the creek nearby in 1994. And in that area, you can still see part of the dam that was there for the mill. The original company mill was a large 2.5-story building that was made from stone, brick, and wood, and it was built on a high stone basement. People would travel from miles around to go to the mill and have their grains ground. You know, that wasn't really like infrastructure that people, or like an appliance that people would have for themselves. You know, you'd have to go to the mill to get it ground. And people, because they were coming from all over, would hang out there and gossip. The 1850 census said that the mill produced 1,166 barrels of flour, and I'm assuming that's an annual number, but I don't actually know. The mill was still operating up until the 1920s, though, and initially when the park was being built, they considered making the area that had been dammed up by the mill a boating area, but then there was a big flood which destroyed most of the rest of the mill, and that put paid to that plan. All right, so let's get to the cemeteries that are hidden out in the woods of this park. So when I started working on my notes for this episode, I felt confident that there were 3 cemeteries: the Young Family Cemetery, the King Family Cemetery, and the Warren Family Cemetery. Those are the 3 that I've seen, and those were, I thought, the only 3 in the park. But it looks like maybe I was wrong, and I'll talk about that more in a sec. So first, let's talk about the Young Family Cemetery. This one, if you're going to go see it, is right off the trailhead of the Loblolly Trail. It's like 1/10 of a mile down that trail. So, you know, if you are at the Reedy Creek parking lot, this starts at the right side of the parking lot, you walk down, and then the cemetery very quickly will be on your right. It has a rusty fence around it, and it's not in good shape. It's really cool, though. And the people buried there seem to have died in the 19th and early 20th century. Some of the tombstones, you know, are toppled. Last time I was there, I saw, you know, all the candles and stuff that people had put out and flowers, but the actual graves and tombstones were not in good shape. They were toppled, etc. But it is cool looking, especially because of, you know, the fence that's surrounding it. Okay, so then the next family cemetery in there is the Warren Family Cemetery, which is sort of in the middle of the park. It is off one of the bridle trails, like, you know, one of the multi-use trails. It's sort of a long hike into the park, but you'll find it on the north side of the Reedy Creek Trail. Right near it, there's like a bulletin board display sort of thing that has info about the history of the family, and there's some cool pictures there. At least 17 people are buried there, and one really interesting thing to me about the cemetery is that the graves are surrounded by rocks. And I've never really seen that outside of North Carolina. I'm sure it's a thing. It's just not a thing that I see in New York City. So, like, there's a tombstone, and then there's just rocks that someone has placed in a circle on top of each of the graves, like where the body would be, kind of like marking that spot. And the rocks look like they're rocks from the surrounding woods. Like I don't know if it's quartz or what, but there are rocks kind of all through the park that are these really pretty sort of sparkly, dirty white color. And those are the rocks that are on these graves. And yeah, I don't know if this is a Southern thing or North Carolina thing or just a not in a big city thing, but for whatever reason, it's really interesting. And these graves are also from the 19th and early 20th century. So then there's the King Family Cemetery. This one is on the east side of the Grayland Multi-Use Trail. There are about 13 tombstones there, as well as a couple grave markers. And the graves there are mostly from the 20th century, starting around 1902 or so. There's a handful of graves from the 1920s and 30s and 50s, up until the 80s and 90s, and there is even one grave from 2012. My general understanding is that members of the family can still be buried in the cemeteries, even though it's technically parkland now. I assume they worked out some deal when it was sold. So those are the 3 cemeteries I knew about, but while I was doing research for this episode, like I mentioned, I stumbled across a Page Family Cemetery, which is apparently also in Umstead State Park. And I was really surprised to see this because I have researched these cemeteries so many times over the last few years, and I've searched Find a Grave so many times for different cemeteries in the park, and I've never seen any mention of this cemetery. But of course, this time when I was looking at Find a Grave, it just popped right up, so I don't know how I missed it before. But like I said, I thought I had hiked all the trails in the park, but I think this one is off one of the multi-use trails, so it's possible that there's some parts of the multi-use trails that I haven't walked on, I suppose. But according to Find a Grave, to get to the Page Family Cemetery, you go in by Reedy Creek Road and you follow it until it intersects with another trail at Midgate, and the cemetery is on the right, about 100 yards away from the Reedy Creek Trail. There are steel chains surrounding it, and there are 8 graves in there. And it sounds like at least some of the burials are from the 19th century. Also, while I was reading about cemeteries in the park, I saw some other mentions that I had somehow missed of other cemeteries there. So I found a topographical map that I could not really read, but it mentioned Smith Cemetery. And I'm not sure if that's just another name for one of the 4 cemeteries that I've already mentioned, or if there's a separate cemetery called the Smith Cemetery. But I did look and try to see if there were any Smiths buried in the cemeteries that I've already talked about, and I didn't see anyone with that last name buried in them. So I'll include a link in the show notes to the map for anyone who wants to try to decipher this map. The report described the cemetery as Smith Cemetery, typical small rural family cemetery with plain granite gravestones interspersed among pine trees. Of the some 10 gravestones, about half are damaged. Elsewhere in the report, it says that the cemetery is occupied by Learys and Smiths, and it says that it dates from the early 20th century. So, more info in that in the show notes at buriedtruthspodcast.com. Then I also found mention of a white family cemetery off of Sycamore Trail. So, I have never noticed this off of Sycamore Trail, but the report says, along the footpath, the hiker can discern CCC land reclamation improvements, reforested hillsides and check dams, early 20th century human-occupied areas, the White Family Cemetery, and a stone chimney ruins. So next time I hike that, I'm going to look out for that cemetery, because I don't think it's super obvious from the trail, but supposedly it exists. At least as of 1995, it was visible from the trail. So I've got a few other really interesting things that I learned about this park's history that I learned while reading this 1995 report. So one of the most interesting things that I found out was that apparently in August of 1941, for 2 weeks, the camp that had been abandoned by the CCC, so, because it took so long to build the park, the people in the Civilian Conservation Corps who had been building it had to build a camp for themselves to live in. And then I think later that was, used by campers. But that camp ended up hosting 169 British Navy seamen and 2 officers. This was during World War II, and the ship they had been on, the HMS Astoria, was in an undisclosed American port because it had sustained damage during the evacuation of Dunkirk, so it needed to be fixed up. So they needed a place to put these members of the British Navy while the ship was being fixed. And they decided to put them in Umstead State Park. And they were there for about 2 weeks while they were waiting for their ship to be fixed. And, in general, during World War II, not many people visited the park. That's because at the time, people were mostly taking private cars or buses to get to the park, but gas rationing prevented people from doing that sort of joyride kind of thing. They had to save gas, so because attendance was so low, the state actually let several army regiments from nearby Camp Butner train there. So during July and August of 1943, almost 7,000 soldiers and 500 vehicles were in the park for these different, training exercises. And apparently it was a very helpful place for them to train because of the hills and the wilderness, but also there were buildings and cabins that they could use for tactical stuff while training. The report didn't go into a ton of details about what sort of training exercises they were, etc., but really interesting. And it really makes me wonder how many state parks in the US might have been used for that sort of thing. And just in general, like I said, even if you don't live anywhere near this park, I think it's safe to say that almost everyone in the United States lives near some state parks, if not also national parks. And it's worth looking and seeing if you're interested in history. Was it used for anything military related during World War II? Are there any hidden cemeteries there? Are there any signs of things that you can look out for to see, where homes might have been before it was a park? I just think that state parks, we think of them as a place to engage with nature, and of course they are. But like I said, it's so easy to forget that state parks are like curated and formed by people. And they're kind of like these constrained places where nature is allowed to be. And it's so easy to feel like, okay, there's woods there, there's trees, those are natural. But, all of that is typically like designed by someone, and someone blazed those trails and, shored up things to make sure they were safe and the parks are being maintained, etc. It really makes you wonder what actual wilderness looked like back in the day, like before so much really damaging farming practices and over harvesting of trees happened at the hands of colonizers. Because I know that indigenous people in the United States had different land stewardship practices, and they were very much engaged in like not curating the land, but in like caring for the land. Like it's not like things were just growing wild. But it would just be so interesting to be able to like travel back in time and see what that might have been like, and then even see what it was like before the indigenous peoples in the United States were cultivating, the woods and all the land here, and to see what it was like before humans even. There's all these layers of history, and I think most of us probably, and maybe I'm just speaking for myself because I live in New York City, but I at least so strongly associate history with places with big buildings and buildings that are still around, because it's much harder to stop and think about history when you're in a place where you're mostly just seeing woods. And I think as humans, we're kind of taught, at least nowadays in our society these days, we're kind of taught that nature is its own thing and is kind of unrelated to our history, and buildings and cities are where our history lives. And like, I'm not trying to say that Raleigh and, like the Triangle is not a major metropolitan area, because it absolutely is. And there are a lot of historic buildings there, etc. But I think when you go out to a state park and you go for a hike in the woods, we feel like we're going there to escape the chaos of life these days, etc. And like the chaos of other people and the weight of human history. But it's all still there if you even look for it a little bit. And of course, where there are people and stories of human habitation, there are always going to be ghost stories as well. So I don't think I'm aware of ghost stories related to Umstead State Park, though I'm still kind of looking for some of those. But there's definitely ghost stories related to Eno River State Park, which I'm going to talk about next time. And, I kind of tend to be of the opinion that everywhere is haunted. So if you are someone from the area and you have any stories of paranormal stuff happening in the park, cryptid encounters, anything like that, I would love to hear it. And you can write to me about that at buriedSecretspodcast@gmail.com. So that's William B. Umstead State Park, one of my favorite places. I think that this is going to be my last episode for December, and I'll come back with the episode about Eno River State Park in January. So I really hope that you have a safe and happy holiday. If you want to hear from me in the meantime, you can sign up for my newsletter at buriedSecretspodcast.com/newsletter. I sent out my first issue of the newsletter last week, and it was all about liminality and vampires, and kind of like vampires existing on the margins of society, and a couple interesting novels that I've read recently that kind of explore that. And if you missed that and you want to read that issue, you can go read it at buriedSecretspodcast.substack.com, and there's also a link from my website to that. You can also follow me on Instagram at Buried Secrets Podcast. And if you liked this episode, please tell your friends about it. Please rate and review on whatever podcatcher you use. And thanks so much for listening.